Welcome to the Storyworks Reading Series, a podcast for readers, writers, and readers curious about writers. I'm your host, Alida Winternheimer. This month, the Storyworks Reading Series brings you the short story Black Bart by S.A. Wolter. I am so honored to get to publish this cowboy's tale and sit down with Susan to discuss its inspiration, challenges, and so much more. Don't miss this moving tale about the last of a generation and a true piece of Americana. Without further ado, here's S.A. Wolter reading Black Bart.
A murder of crows squawked from the lilacs when Roy stepped out of his house. Damn crows were jeering at him. The heavy wooden screen door swung shut with a double wrap on its frame. Crows could spot the weak and indecisive, mock them with their confident, strident voices. Those scavengers had watched him leave the house each morning, rifle in hand, for 2 weeks now. Roy knew damn well what needed to be done. The initial thought had hardened into conviction over time, insidious in the way it had turned from a possibility to a certainty. His old 30-30 lever-action Savage was loaded. He could just as well get it done that day. Roy grasped the handrail Sarah had insisted he build when they added the deck to the house all those years ago. If a man can't walk down 3 steps, he's got bigger problems than a broken leg, Roy had told her. A man doesn't need to ask for trouble, Sarah had said. It'll find him soon enough. Sarah had been right about that, too. Roy's knees crackled like he was stepping on weedings as he hobbled down the steps, his lips tight against the pain. Old Doc McPhail had pestered him to have surgery on his knees 25 years ago. Goddamn surgeries laid a man up for months, so he'd limped along, swallowing aspirin on the bad days. Aspirin didn't do a damn thing anymore. Some days his knees hurt so bad that he could barely get off the pot. Those pain pills made him loopy in the head. Now that new young doctor told him even if he survived the anesthesia and major joint trauma, his bones might be too old and brittle to knit back together again. Hell, he'd never planned on still being around at the age of 92. Caw, caw, one of the crows flew up, rattling the others into the air. The birds glided to the misshapen old elm in the corner of the yard, where they shrilly bantered from the gnarled branches. Maybe the birds were kin. Brothers. Roy missed his brothers. Didn't make a lick of sense that he'd be the last one. Should have been Albert, the quiet one, the one to think before he acted. Or even Joe, who'd found a reason to smile every day, although it had taken a few years after he returned from the war in the Pacific for the upturn of his mouth to seep back into his eyes. All the old ones, except Roy, were gone. No one left who'd witnessed land so dry, grasshoppers starved, or seen a child crippled from polio. Some sights changed a man's way of thinking about the world. Roy limped across the lawn, avoiding bare spots where the grass had died and left a dirt bowl that could make old feet stumble. After a long North Dakota winter, the spring sun had gained enough angle on the horizon to carry some warmth. The heat soaked into his bones, taking the edge off the arthritis in his hands. Roy squinted. Maybe it was shaping up to be too fine of a day to pull the trigger. The old black Angus bull stood waiting alongside the corral fence. Black Bart's tail twitched with the impatient tap of a finger on the face of a watch. Gravel crunched as Roy shuffled across the road between the house and the barn. You're just an old beggar with a sweet tooth, Roy said to the bull as he neared the corral. Black Bart turned his head to focus on Roy. The bull's blind eye was a blue eye. Roy had seen the pus and cloudy cornea when he was out checking cows in the pasture a half-dozen years ago. Antibiotics had saved the eyeball, but it had come too late to stop the pupil from disappearing. Roy stopped at the fence and transferred the rifle to his left hand. The bull had lost weight, but he still carried the confirmation of muscle and bone that had so impressed Roy the first time he saw the animal in Sven Bjornson's corral. Bjornson's breath had wafted stale whiskey fumes as his lubricated jaw talked up one young bull after another. Roy kept his distance and scanned the herd. One young bull, his eyes gleaming black and sharp, was watching him. His deep body promised a capacity for hay and weight gain in both himself and his offspring. His rear end had thickness, but not so much that it would give the cows trouble birthing his calves. The bull moved away, and Roy watched the animal's gait, how the back hooves nearly stepped on the track made by the front hooves. Roy moved along the fence until he could see the animal's ear-tag number. He almost smiled. "I'll take him," Roy said, pointing at the bull and cutting Bjornson off mid-sentence. "Him?" Bjornson said. "He's small. What about this one?" He pointed to a larger animal that was short across the back. Roy shook his head. The bull had been born late, which Bjornson ought to remember, and Roy was investing in the animal's long-term potential. "Load him up." Roy pulled his keys from his jeans pocket. Sarah came out of the house, carrying the towel she'd used to dry her hands to watch Roy unload the bull. "Is he as good as you'd hoped?" Sarah asked. "Better." Roy had pored over the bull pedigrees. Pedigrees told everything: the amount of milk the daughters would generate, weight gain, size of udders, the amount of marble in their steaks, and more, including disposition. Roy paid attention to disposition. He didn't want a bunch of high-headed cows giving him stink eye every time he worked the herd. When that type dropped a calf, they'd put a man over the fence. "I got him loaded in the stock trailer before Bjornson sobered up long enough to figure out what he was selling." Roy. Sarah never wanted to hear unkind comments about anyone. Roy had never been much of a talker, and her prohibition carved a sizable chunk out of his verbal observations. "What's his name?" "Craftig Car 1124. Sarah wrinkled her nose. She didn't speak Norwegian. "It means strong vessel." Sarah shook her head. Roy swung open the back gate of the stock trailer. The back end of the trailer lurched, the steel door and inside partition clanking as the young bull stepped out. The black beast lifted his head and scanned the place before ambling away. "Black Bart," Sarah said. "What?" "His name should be Black Bart. Black Bart was a scoundrel that robbed stagecoaches." Sarah folded the damp towel in quarters. "But he was a gentleman. He never shot anyone he robbed." If Sarah liked history, reading thick books from the library, peppering her conversations with facts Roy never remembered an hour later. "Black Bart probably made some lady a fine husband when he settled down," Sarah said. Roy wasn't so sure about the chances of the original Black Bart being fine husband material, but he hoped this bull would be a gentleman. A bull could easily injure himself in the course of his dealings with the ladies. Then he became nothing more than expensive hamburger. It seemed like a good omen. Roy nodded. Black Bart it was. 4 years later, the cancer took his Sarah. Black Bart followed Roy along the last bit of fence, limping until they reached the barn. The bull's left front knee was swollen and gnarled like a knot in a spool of baling twine. The right knee canted off to one side. The joints had carried the animal's massive weight too many years. Roy needed to put the bull down before the pain got too bad. Too bad was an elusive thing to determine. At least that's what Roy told himself. Hell, it was either that or admit he was turning into a damn coward. Roy slid the wooden barn door open. Inside, the light seemed dim after the bright sun. The air smelled of hay and aged wood, dried manure, pigeons, and the lingering scent of animal hides, although the only animal in the barn was a skinny mother cat whose tail twitched at a young pigeon's nervous coo. Roy leaned the gun against the grain bin wall and unlatched the door, releasing the thick, dusty odor of ground oats. He grabbed the metal 5-gallon bucket. Roy held on to the door jamb and stepped over the boards nailed low across the opening. As he scooped ground oats, the dented steel bucket scraped the concrete floor. Black Bart's teeth had gone bad. Ground oats chewed easier than tough hay grass. Roy had never seen a bull live past 9 or 10. The old boy had passed 14 years last month. He could use the extra calories too. On Roy's bad mornings, the thought of Black Bart waiting for him made Roy grit his teeth and swing his legs over the side of the bed. Roy had sold his cowherd 3 years ago. He kept his cowboy hat pulled low on his forehead the day the semi came to haul out the last of his girls. No one had wanted an old bull with bad knees. His son, Darrell, had offered to drive out from town and dump a load of hay in the feeder for Black Bart when he needed it, but he was not a stay-up-all-night calving sort. His older brother, Pete, was even less so. 2 sons, and neither one a cattleman. How in the hell had that happened? You can't turn a turnip into a carrot, Sarah had told Roy when he'd first started to suspect this was the way things would play out. Turnips give me the bellyache. That's all in your head, Sarah had said. Pete kept telling Roy to get rid of the bull, told him he was going to give himself a heart attack lugging buckets of feed. Roy suspected Pete's wife, Mary Lou, was angling to tie the old man to a rocking chair at the nursing home and be quit of him. Mary Lou had her sights firmly fixed on a large RV and a retirement village in Florida. They'd raised 2 children and managed to get them out of the house, although Roy wasn't convinced the daughter had the gumption to work hard enough to pay rent. She was a pretty thing, a nice gal, but she'd always been too darn spoiled. Mary Lou said Roy was going to trip over a pile of dried shit and break a hip. Then he'd be sorry. Roy couldn't see how Mary Lou was going to lug those extra pounds of hers around in the Florida heat, but he sure as hell kept that thought to himself. Darrell drove out to feed Black Bart, so if anyone had reason to complain, it'd be him. He never did. Darrell didn't rile easily, although every once in a while he'd latch his teeth onto something. Last week, Darrell started talking about the new assisted living apartments going up in town. His dad should take a look. Roy had pretended not to hear. Darrell was coming out this evening to fill the hay feeder. Roy suspected his son would bring it up again. Darrell ought to focus on his own damn self. After Darrell's first wife had left him, he'd promptly married another gal, a drinker, who'd convinced Darrell to hold down the legs of the bar stool next to her. Roy had been relieved when the divorce had been final on the second one. It had taken a few years, but Darrell eventually straightened himself out. Roy wished he'd find someone else. It was hard for a man to take on life alone. Some nights Roy still listened for the sounds of Sarah puttering in the kitchen. Roy set the feed bucket down and unlatched the side barn door. As Black Bart trudged over to the feed bunk, Roy studied the animal's gait. Had the old bull's limp worsened overnight? Everyone wants to live a long time, Roy said, but no one wants to get so goddamn old. When the bull reached the feed bunk, he stopped and eyed Roy. You're a damn spoiled beast, God knows. Roy picked up the feed bucket and stepped out into the corral. All the pedigree research on disposition had paid off in Black Bart. Whenever Roy had been out checking the herd, he'd always been able to walk up to the bull. Black Bart liked to have his back end scratched, especially at his tailhead. One time, Black Bart had gone courting in a neighbor's pasture. The neighbor had called when he'd spotted the black head in with his brown Herefords. Roy drove over with the stock trailer. I can run home and get a few portable corral panels to load him, the neighbor offered. Nah, Roy said, don't need them. Roy opened the back end of the stock trailer and grabbed the 5-gallon metal bucket containing some oats. He walked out into the herd. The neighbor's cows lurched and scattered. Roy clanked the bucket a few times. Black Bart ambled over and followed Roy into the stock trailer. Roy spilled a little bit of grain on the floor and shut the door. The neighbor had laughed. That's the biggest pet dog I've ever seen. Now Roy spread the ground oats along the bottom of the wooden feed bunk. The bull immediately stuck his black nose in it, his substantial head bobbing as he worked the grain. Ranching was a business. A bull the size of Black Bart could eat 30 pounds of hay a day. If a bull went lame, you shot him, ground him up for hamburger. The cows that came open in December went down the road to the sales ring. Shoveling sentiment into a bucket didn't keep a cow alive. I've gone soft in the head, Roy said. That's my damn problem. Black Bart's thick tongue rasped the worn wood. The pasture next to the corral was taking on the bright green flush of new grass. Close by, 2 ducks circled a ragged spit of a slough. Suddenly, the ducks squawked and slapped their wingtips on the water in a frantic scramble to get airborne. They gained altitude in a low, quacking trajectory straight over Black Bart and Roy. Black Bart, his blind eye on the side of the commotion, swung his rigid 1,900-pound frame sideways to get a look. His rump rammed into Roy. Roy toppled like a shaft of wheat under a heavy boot. The metal bucket flew up in the air. His hip hit the edge of the feed bunk. The bone audibly snapped. Roy crumpled to the ground. He sucked in air and held it against the pain. When he needed to exhale, he did so in short spurts, then gulped air back into his lungs. His heart thumped wild in his chest. Maybe he passed out, or maybe his memory blanked for a spell. Slowly, Roy became aware of the pungent smell of manure. He was lying in the corral, tucked over in a slight C shape, his nostril an inch or so from the ground. Black Bart's tongue scoured the wooden planks of the feed bunk. God damn it all to hell. Roy pushed himself up on his elbow, breathing from the top half of his lungs. He grabbed the edge of the feed bunk and tried to pull himself up. The pain exploded. Roy gritted his teeth and kept trying until he feared he might pass out. Hell, he'd once wrestled calves. Now he didn't have the strength to get on his own goddamn feet. Roy rested a few minutes and then tried to crawl. The hoof-churned soil and dried manure shifted beneath him like a liar's convictions. Roy slumped back into the dirt. The buzzing flies soon found him in the manure. The little devil seemed partial to his prickly whisker stubble. Roy cursed and swatted. As the sun angled westward, the promised heat baked everything in the corral. Wispy puffs of cumulus clouds provided only occasional brief breaks from the sun's glare. Roy's mouth dried out. He hollered for Sarah, hoping she might hear him from the house. Maybe she could bring him a drink of water, drop a couple of ice cubes in the glass. The damn crows came instead. The black bastards flew over the corral, their outstretched wings serrated like a steak knife. Their raucous scorn jolted Roy back to the truth that Sarah would never hear him, no matter how hard he yelled. One large crow landed on a fence post. A few of his brethren strutted along the top corral board, cocking their heads in contemplation of Roy's situation. Even their beaks were scorched soul black. Roy had been a fool to leave his rifle in the barn. Sometime in the late afternoon, Roy watched Black Bart slowly trudge to the water tank. The bull's limp jangled the pendulum swish of his tail. Black Bart's head lurched low as he hobbled to turn around. Roy had waited too long. That was plain to him now. I can be a selfish son of a bitch, Roy said. One autumn, Sarah had told Roy she wanted to sign up for a history class at the college. Roy had pointed out the issues. The school was 60 miles away, icy roads in the winter. Someone needed to cook supper for the boys. And where would the money come from? What was the payoff? Was Sarah going to feed historical facts to the chickens? Maybe you could take a cooking class, Roy told her. The boys and me, we always appreciate your cooking. That winter had been a cold one. Sarah cooked and cleaned, same as she'd always done, but missing was the chatter about the neighbors or something heard on the radio, the humming while she wiped down the counters in the kitchen. I hurt you that time, Roy said aloud. The next spring, in March, when the purple crocuses had bloomed next to the last dirty skiffs of snow, Roy took off his sweat-stained cap and filled it with velvet-kissed flowers. Sarah was sitting at the sewing machine, patching knees on the boys' pants when he got home. Sometimes a man gets more beauty than he deserves, Roy said. I don't know why I put up with you, Sarah had said, but she put down the jeans and took the cap full of flowers. From where Roy lay, he could see long clouds of gravel dust rolling down the town to Market Road about a mile south of his place. Oil traffic. Trucks and semis beating the road into a washboard, hauling in a drilling rig over by Prescott's hay slough. For a while, Roy counted them, but he lost count in the 20s. Used to be there wouldn't be 25 cars on that road in a week. Oil companies kept tight lips, but they had to be smelling money. Some of the local folks were excited about the possibility of oil in the Bakken. Whatever happened, life in these parts would never be the same. Money, or lack of it, twisted around a man's thoughts and choked off his common sense. Roy's stomach growled at supper time. His dry mouth puckered at the thought of Sarah's strawberry jam on toast. Sarah made the sweetest strawberry jam. Sometimes she baked buttermilk biscuits, and the jam oozed over the warm layers of pastry. Roy tried to shift his position and grunted at the flare of hot pain in his hip. One time he'd mentioned to Mary Lou that maybe he could find Sarah's strawberry jam recipe if she was interested. Mary Lou had snorted and said there were shelves of jam at Walmart. The temperature cooled as the sun gave up on the day. The fertile dirt between Roy soaked up whatever small reserves of strength he'd once had left. Black Bart stood with his head low in the corner of the corral. Black Bart's sons and daughters had been the best calves Roy had ever raised. The daughters' udders had nearly dropped milk on their calves' heads. The sons had gained weight efficiently. Almost every one of them had shown the even temperament of their sire. Roy could not have asked for more. Maybe the most accurate measure of a bull's life was what he left behind when he died. When Roy first heard Darryl drive up to the barn and park, he wasn't sure if the sound was real or imagined. Real, he decided. Darryl's tangle with the booze-soaked reliability of his second wife had given him an appreciation for routine. He always parked in front of the barn and fed the bull before coming to the house. Roy's throat was so damn parched that he hollered several times before Darryl heard him and came looking. Darryl protested when Roy told him to get the 30-30 Savage from the barn. That bull is hurting, Roy said. He's an old bastard. It's time. Fine, I'll do it later. Darryl checked his cell phone. Right now I'm going to call an ambulance. Roy snorted. Those fancy cell phones have never worked here. They're not likely to start in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to the house to call. Hell, I've been lying in cowship most of the day. Another couple of minutes won't matter a damn bit. Dad. Darryl looked like he'd been sucking lemons. You've been crazy in the head about that bull since he walked on the place. Look where it got you. God damn it, Roy levered himself up on his elbow. The pain sucked in his breath. I want to make sure it's done right. Darryl opened his mouth, then shut it tight. He shook his head. Do it, Roy said. Then you can haul me away. Jesus, you never give a damn inch, do you? Darryl turned and trotted for the barn, the bottom edge of his T-shirt fluttering where it dangled off his gut. Hell, who knew a man could hurt this bad? Roy eased himself back down into the cradle of manure that had formed to fit his shoulders. Darryl returned with the rifle. Make damn sure it's a clean shot. The muscles along the back of Darryl's jaw tightened. You sure you want to see this? You think I've gone soft? Darryl snorted. Not hardly. Make an X, Roy said, between the eyes and the ears. Aim for the center of the X. His heartbeat intensified, not faster, but harder, like it could thump right through the old bones in his chest. Don't pull the trigger if your heart is racing. Wait for your heartbeat to settle. Steady heart, straight shot. I know how to shoot a gun, Darryl said, eyeing the bull, a couple of inches above the eyes. When Roy didn't answer, Darryl snapped his head around to look at him. Roy nodded. Roy's eyes were closed when the shot rang out. He deserved to be tired. It had been a hell of a day. The tang of burnt gunpowder drifted in the air. You okay, Dad? Daryl's face blurred briefly and then sharpened. He was hunkered down next to Roy, the gun leaning against the feed bunk. I've had better days, Roy said. Daryl reached out and gripped Roy's hand. I'm going to go call the ambulance. His son felt like an electric blanket. Roy realized he was cold. You're a good boy, Roy said. Take after your mother in that. He sucked in air. Damn pain. His air didn't seem to want to go lower than the top of his lungs. Daryl started to pull his hand away, but Roy gripped it. You and your brother need to work hard in school. Get good grades. Hang in there, Dad. Daryl squeezed Roy's hand. He took off for the house in the jagged run of the stiff and overweight. Roy watched until he disappeared behind the garage. Both of his sons had inherited his cussedness, but Sarah had sweetened the rough edges. Roy grunted as he pulled out the narrow piece of wood he'd carved and carried in his pocket for 2 weeks. His arm wobbled as he reached for his rifle. He'd hoped his boys would someday understand, especially Daryl, who'd be cursed with finding him. Black Bart had crumpled where he'd been standing and then rolled to his side. His head lay at an unnatural angle. Death never granted dignity, just an end. Roy swung the lever action out and back. He settled the gun butt against a cavity in the hoof-pocked dirt. The muzzle end of the rifle branded a cool circle beneath his chin. He stretched his arm, dropping his shoulder to reach farther, and then settled the carved end of the wood extender on the curve of the trigger. Black Bart's dark hide reflected the last lingering glints of sun. His Sarah had been right. She'd recognized a gentle heart when she saw it. Roy waited, firmly gripping the wood extender, until his heartbeat settled.
That was S.A. Wolter reading Black Bart. Susan grew up dreaming under epic North Dakota skies, surrounded by hard red spring wheat, black Angus, and family. She earned an MFA in creative writing from Hamline University. While at Hamline, she was a graduate teacher and an assistant fiction editor of Waterstone Review, Volume 19. She has been twice honored with Minnesota Artist Initiative grants in prose and was a 2014 Loft Mentor Series Fellow. These days, she abandons the main floor of her home to a work-from-home husband and opinionated cat to hole up in the basement and work on her novel. Well, Susan, thank you so much for bringing Black Bart to the StoryWorks reading series. It's such a powerful story. I've loved it since I first saw it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, there's a lot to talk about, but let's start at the beginning. You grew up on a cattle farm, and I believe we're going to share a picture of you as a girl with a cow in the show notes, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. So I imagine this story is meaningful to you, or is it just a matter of writing what you know?
Probably some of both. That place is very meaningful for me, and the people that are there are my people. So that is very true. That it's a meaningful thing, and it is somewhat writing what I know. Of course, I grew up with cattle, and I don't always know a lot. I get a lot of help from my brothers, my dad. Maybe I know enough to be dangerous. But then I ask lots of questions, and they help me with some of the details.
So what inspired this story?
The character, I guess. Roy was kind of a character that was in my head, and I didn't actually probably know what was going to happen, but he was an elderly man, and I know he had a lot of health issues, a lot of pain issues. And so it was kind of following his story.
The setting is so important to the story. It feels like a character to me, in part because Roy is a cattleman and he is someone who lives on the land. And off the land and knows it so intimately, but also because it evokes so much as a reader. It contributes so much to the mood of the piece. Were you thinking of it as a character and trying to craft it that way, or did it just sort of spring up naturally as, the world Roy happens to live in?
I guess probably more the latter. I mean, I think it just sprang up as to this is that world. I do think that world is important to this story, and so certainly that's influencing it. And I would be looking at the landscape, I guess, and the place as I was writing it.
Roy, this story is told in such a close third-person point of view, where we have the narrator telling the story, but we're seeing everything through Roy's perspective as he moves through his day. And Roy would take the setting for granted because he is such a part of that setting, and it is such an everyday piece of his world. Can you talk a little bit about balancing that close third point of view with evoking something for a reader who's never been there, who's never seen that place, and what went into really telling the story through Roy's eyes?
That's an very interesting question. When I first wrote this story, it wasn't such a close third. And as I was working with the story and working with the challenges that the story brought to me, it became kind of evident to me that this really needed to be very close to Roy, because every time you kind of introduce an authorial narrator, you kind of pull out a little bit. And I wanted this story to be very character driven, very close to Roy. And so that was kind of driving that point of view.
I think what makes Roy such a worthy point of view character is that he's an observer. He's an observer of nature. When he notices the crows, he notices the clouds. When he purchased Black Bart, he studied the pedigree. He's very conscientious. And we know through his thoughts and feelings about Sarah and his sons and his daughters-in-law that he pays attention to what everyone is doing around him. He's also crotchety and judgmental, yet he's kind and appreciative as well. I love the richness of his character that's coming through in this very tightly woven narrative. Did you find it difficult at any point to inhabit the perspective of a 92-year-old rancher and, capturing that perspective as he shows us his world?
Not particularly, because these are my people, and so I could, no, I'm not a 92-year-old man, nor will I ever be. But, it was certainly reasonable and for me to imagine and to try to inhabit that world. I grew up surrounded by family, and I had a lot of, I knew a lot of great grandparents, great aunts, great uncles. There were a lot of people that were elderly, and I actually really enjoy elderly people just because of their rich history and their stories. And I am a storyteller, I guess. So it was kind of drawing probably on lots of things that I'd heard them say or things that they had done over the years that kind of fed this story. And I guess I hope I got it right. You always hope that when you're writing, but I felt like I did know him.
Mm-hmm. I think it comes through, that you know this person. It feels very authentic. And while I'm not from North Dakota or a ranch or a farm, I am a Midwesterner. And some of the moments in this narrative make me chuckle because I recognize them. Was there anything you inserted here where you're like, oh yeah, this is how they sound, or this is how, what did you consciously make any choices to capture that character?
I would listen, you hear them, you hear their voice kind of in your ear as you're writing. And, there would be things, especially like things that they would say. And I would think, yep, that's what he would say, so, then I would try to, capture that or type that down. A lot of times it's interesting because, when I'm just thinking about it, I wouldn't. But if I was writing, fingers on the keyboard, really into this character, and I'm typing, and then it just kind of comes out this way. It's like, because you really, I guess, this character is deep inside you, and then the dialogue would come out that would be like, yeah, that is exactly what he would say, although I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, obviously I did as I typed, but not, beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that when you're in the moment of doing the writing in that kind of flow state, that's when it comes out, and not when you're consciously trying to capture it. Hearing it read, there are these words, hell, and a pause, and then a sentence, and it could be a comma there, but having the actual text typed out in front of me, I know it's hell, period, and then a new sentence. And that's one of those little characteristic things that I love about this story that feels so true to Roy, that hell is just its own sentence, and it just kind of encapsulates that moment and that feeling that Roy is expressing. So this story obviously is about Roy and his cow, Black Bart, but it's also about growing old and relationships and love. The use of subtext is so powerful here, which is what has always drawn me to this story. Did one come before the other for you? Did you start writing Roy going out to feed the cow and he falls and he can't get up? Or did you start writing a story about growing old and relationships? And how did that work for you? How did it come together?
I think they kind of came together as I wrote it. It's been a while, but, as you were on this role, I mean, he was old, obviously, from the beginning. And so, when he steps out the door, this is an elderly man. And, it's just taking, following him in his footsteps and thinking about what he's experiencing as he, does these things. It kind of came together, I guess, probably at the same time.
Do you have a short story or personal essay ready to meet the world? We are open for submissions, and I would love to see your work. Go to storyworkspodcast.com/submit for all the details, and send me your best writing today. Is there a criteria that you have in mind when you were writing this story and choosing what to leave out of it from those earlier drafts? What was behind some of those choices? Do you remember some criteria that
really what advances this story? Not, some interesting little thing that I observed or I liked, or, it's, the saying, you need to kill your darlings. I mean, it's truly what you kind of need to do at times. I mean, you really need to keep cutting down to what's really essential to this story. Mm-hmm. And as difficult as that can be sometimes to cut some of those phrases or sentences or even paragraphs or whatever that you just totally love, it's kind of amazing when you see the story kind of come together. And all of a sudden, how the tightness of it makes that story come alive. And all of that cutting was worth it, because it just made that story start to breathe on its own.
I'd like to look at the opening of the story. So in the first paragraph, you establish the mood of the piece, the point of view. There's intrigue, there's tension. It's tightly packed, and it's even ominous, the way it landed with me. So would you read us that first paragraph again, so we can refresh our memories?
Sure. A murder of crows squawked from the lilacs when Roy stepped out of his house. Damn crows were jeering at him. The heavy wooden screen door swung shut with a double wrap on its frame. Crows could spot the weak and indecisive, mock them with their confident, strident voices. Those scavengers had watched him leave the house each morning, rifle in hand, for 2 weeks now. Roy knew damn well what needed to be done. The initial thought had hardened into conviction over time, insidious in the way it had turned from a possibility to a certainty. His old 30-30 lever-action Savage was loaded. He could just as well get it done that day.
The crows jeer at Roy. Mm-hmm. And, because it is this close third, Roy is using them to accuse himself of being weak and indecisive. There's this sort of mirroring happening. And, we understand because he's ornery, he feels like they're up in his business. No. Roy does not appreciate that. And so the tension starts to build as we wonder, what are they showing him? Why doesn't he like it? And then we get to that gun in his hand, and there are real stakes here. Did you have challenges getting dramatic tension into this story? A close third, single character for most of it story. And how hard did you work to get all of that into the first paragraph?
I worked very hard for that. This story has actually been around, that I've had this story for a while, for years, actually. But one of, a couple things always bothered me. One of them was the dramatic tension in this story. And it just started so slow. And in fact, in the original versions, he does not have a gun in this paragraph. The crows aren't there. I mean, he's just walking out the door. So when I went back to revise this story, dramatic tension, I had to start thinking pretty hard about this dramatic tension and what I was going to do. And that's kind of when the crows showed up here, the gun showed up here. I mean, all of that. The close point of view, the close third was also part of that decision too, to kind of get really, to never really get too far away from Roy, to keep very close to that point of view.
Mm-hmm. So when you pulled back and were in a more distant or authorial narrative, what happened to that tension? Can you talk a little bit more about that choice?
You got pulled out of the story, a little bit, that somebody is talking to you and all of a sudden you're not with Roy anymore. So you're listening to somebody else, and it stopped some of the push of that story. Another thing that I really struggled with the story was the flashbacks. Use of flashbacks stopped the forward momentum of the current story, right? So but yet in this particular story, they're very relevant to where he is at that given point, and at that. Mm-hmm. And so how do I deal with that? I mean, it drove some craft decisions, like how the dialogue plays in those flashbacks, which ones were used, how fast I got in and out of them. All of that played a role too. And again, trying to keep this story, the forward momentum and the tension of the story going.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine this story without those flashbacks, and I think while the tension is in the now action of the story with the crows and the gun, and there are some turning points, he's building our concern and curiosity throughout. We see that Roy and Black Bart, he's talking about the cow, but he's really talking about himself. They both have the bad knees. They're both old timers. They're both left behind and alone. So the tension is building there because we're concerned about him. But then when he falls, there's a key moment, a critical moment in the story really hinges on that. But the plot of the story is an old man falls and he can't get up, right? But why do we care about the old man? Why do we care about him getting up? And that's really because of his flashbacks, his thoughts, his memories, what takes us into the broader arena of his life. And that's where we get to see him as a full person, with love, with concerns, with taking care of people. He's really a bit of a romantic in my mind.
Yeah, a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know, is there anything you want to say about those flashbacks and the choices you made and how they factored into this tension that we were just talking about?
Well, even kind of going back to the beginning of this conversation about when you choose what's going to stay in the story and what goes, what is relevant to the story. It's really honing in on those things that actually propel the story itself. And the flashbacks, not getting into them until they're kind of necessary for the next piece of understanding. So kind of timing how those all play out, which ones are used, and what's cut. I mean, there was a lot cut out of that, and staying as brief as possible, really.
One of the many reasons why I love this story is because when I first read it, all of the clues are there. The ending is set up perfectly. It's structured meticulously. And yet, because I like Roy, I want to believe the gun is just for Black Bart. When he leaves the house and he's talking about doing it, and it might be too fine of a day to do it, and he left it till too long, and you just keep clinging to the idea that this is all for Black Bart. And so the end, despite its inevitability, was surprising.
I guess I tried to just follow Roy and Black Bart's trajectory through this story. I have a saying on my desk that I really like. It's a Hemingway saying. It says, "As a writer, you should not judge, you should understand." And I like that in that it's like you're not in judgment of your characters or what decisions they make or where they end up. You just need to understand them enough to show what's happening, I guess. And I think that's important in stories that, anyway, in the important stories that I love is just really having a character that's living their own thoughts and lives and choices, and having to live with some of their choices.
Right. That's a great quote. Great quote. And that really comes through going back to the close third person point of view and what you were saying about when you went to a more distant authorial narrative, you were pulled out of the story and pulled out of Roy's experience. And I think the ending is so inevitable and is so believable and compelling and also moving because we are in that close third, because we are understanding and not judging as we go through this whole day with Roy and all of his memories and really seeing him as a person, as a complex person.
Thank you. That's what I hope, is that it's a glimpse into Roy, in his world and his thoughts and his decisions.
The story feels like something of a time capsule to me. Roy feels like a time capsule himself. He references the war in the Pacific and the Great Depression and polio.
Yeah, I mean, it is a time capsule. I mean, all stories need to be set at some point in time, and you probably need to know that as a writer so that you're consistent about, what you're talking about. I think it is a little bit, it's like the end of an era. that the story has always been to me a little bit of an end of an era story. And so kind of like the beginning of the oil exploration in the Bakken is kind of the beginning of a new era there. And so putting that at that time frame made a lot of sense to me. Not that I think I thought about it a great deal, but maybe subconsciously I did, because I do really think of him as an end of an era. And, not being willing to go on too much longer. It's where I grew up. There's a piece of that place that is here in my heart that, I will carry with me forever.
Well, I am honored to have the opportunity to publish Black Bart, and thank you so much for sitting down with me to talk about your story, Susan. This has been such a pleasure.
I'm happy to do that, and really, I think the honor is mine for you choosing Black Bart to be part of the StoryWorks reading series. This has truly been an exciting opportunity for me, so I wish you all the best in this new endeavor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks reading series. Please subscribe, rate, and review us so other readers and writers can find the show.